By the way, before I begin my little reading segment for this video, you'll notice that there's a shift between this segment and the analysis that follows. That's because I'm filming all of this out of whack. I've actually been a little bit ill over the last couple of weeks, so I'm just filming bits and pieces as I can and sticking them together. So this is an extract from Books of Blood Volume. It's the second book, but I think it's volume 4 or 5 from a story called Down Satan, which I think is one of the best in the collection. I really like this story. It was a fine plot, but how was he to realize it? The devil did not just come at a call, even for a tycoon such as Gregorius, and his researches soon proved that all the traditional methods of summoning the Lord of Vermin, the defiling of the Blessed Sacrament, the sacrificing of babes, were no more effective than his good works had been at provoking Yahweh. It was only after a year of deliberation that he finally fell upon his master plan. He would arrange to have built a hell on earth, a modern inferno so monstrous that the tempter would be tempted and come to roost there like a cuckoo in a usurped nest. He searched high and low for an architect, and found, languishing in a madhouse outside Florence, a man called Leopardo, whose plans for Mussolini's palaces had a lunatic grandeur that suited Gregorius's project perfectly. Leopardo was taken from his cell, a fetid, wretched old man, and given his dreams again. His genius for the prodigious had not deserted him. In order to fuel his invention, the great libraries of the world were scoured for descriptions of hells both secular and metaphysical. Museums, vaults were ransacked for forbidden images of martyrdom. No stone was left unturned if it was suspected something perverse was concealed beneath. The finished designs owed something to de Sade and to Dante, and something more to Freud and Krafft Ebing, but there was also much there that no mind had conceived of before, or at least ever dared set to paper. A site in North Africa was chosen, and work on Gregorius's new hell began. Everything about the project broke the records. Its foundations were vaster, its walls thicker, its plumbing more elaborate than any edifice hitherto attempted. Gregorius watched its slow construction with an enthusiasm he had not tasted since his first years as an empire builder. Needless to say, he was widely thought to have lost his mind. Friends he had known for years refused to associate with him. Several of his companies collapsed when investors took fright at reports of his insanity. He didn't care. His plan could not fail. The devil would be bound to come, if only out of curiosity to see what this Leviathan built in his name, and when he did, Gregorius would be waiting. It's interesting. I came to the Books of Blood, Barker's first work after the Hellbound Heart, which most people don't know about. I mean, even a lot of Barker fans have never read the Hellbound Heart, and a lot of Barker fans don't even know it exists, that Hellraiser is based on a book. I certainly didn't until very late on in my my experience of Barker's work, my obsession with it. I mean, like most things, most of the things that obsess me, most of the things I really enjoy. I came to Barker's work kind of ass backwards. My first exposure was Hellraiser, as most people's is. But after that, it was pretty much nothing. I vaguely remember watching Cabal when I was very, very young, maybe as a video rental, and enjoying it a great deal. I certainly remember watching The Candyman, which was much later. But when I watched The Candyman, I had no idea that Barker had anything to do with it. I didn't know it was based on one of the short stories from this collection. No idea at all. It wasn't until I got to university, really, that I started to really delve in. I started to really explore this guy's work. And it was wonderful. I mean, my first experience was Weaveworld, which is a very odd entry point for Barker's work, because Weaveworld is one of the denser, one of the stranger, one of the more abstruse works that Barker has ever produced. It's an odd entry point. And I imagine unless you're of a particular nature, it could prove very alienating. WeWorld, although it's often marketed as a work of horror or alongside horror books, it's not. It's not at all. It really isn't. It's something. It's far more a work of metaphysical fantasy with horror elements, if you like. But it's the same with a lot of Barker's work. It all tends to get lumped into horror when it's pretty much genre defying as well as genre defining. It's very much like Philip K. Dick's work, which is often lumped into science fiction, even though a lot of it is not science fiction at all. The same is true of WeWorld, which is a wonderful book, one of my favourites, and which is probably going to be the longest video of this, because it's the one that I return to again and again and again and again. I've read WeWorld probably more than any other book in history. I've read WeWorld about, it must be close. It must be knocking near 50 times, maybe even more than that. WeWorld, I find an endless source of inspiration, of possibility. I think it's a stunning book. The Books of Blood, are very, very different. This is when these were made when Barker was still riding high on the sort of the new Darkling Prince of Horror thing. These were written, insofar as I'm aware, and published, I think, before Hellraiser came out, before the film, and they did not sell particularly well back then, because Barker was nobody. Barker was a nobody. He was, when he got these out in the world, he was living in a squat in London with his little theatre company on the dole, and he had no means of marketing himself. He had nothing. It wasn't until Hellraiser and Stephen King. There's a quote that it's it. Clive Barker is an important, exciting, and enormously talented writer. That isn't the one. There is a quote from Stephen King, because these books happen to land on Stephen King's desk somehow. But there is a quote by Stephen King that is on every single bloody work that Barker's ever published, which is, "I have seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker." That's sort of what these are. These came out sort of in the wake of King and the resurgence of Ramsey Campbell's work and lots of others as well. There was, largely thanks to Stephen King, there was this huge upsurge in horror in the mainstream in the 1980s for some reason, sort of the late 1970s through the 1980s and through into the mid 90s, and horror fiction in literature became enormously profitable. Enormously. Stephen King for a brief time was one of the biggest selling writers in existence, and there are hundreds of established names in the genre who really they may not have started there, but they certainly had a sort of heyday there. Ramsey Campbell was writing long before that, but Ramsey's work became much more widely known during that period. You had Dean Koontz, who I loathe, who is sort of like your poor man's King. And a number of others, hundreds. Graham Masterton came around in that period. Sean Hudson was very popular in that period. Who is the guy who wrote The Darkness? I can't remember his name. John Saul, who wrote The Darkness, which is one of the early horror books I read. Loads and loads and loads of people were getting published at that time, and Barker is one of them. The Books of Blood are very, very odd. They're very unusual, even amongst the horror of the era, which was rife with invention and lots of different themes and subjects. A very florid era in mainstream horror. The Books of Blood stand out because they're so unusual. I remember getting these and reading them for the first time, and although they are, I suppose you could call them less broad than WeWorld. They're certainly less ambitious than WeWorld, because, of course, these are some of the first works. He's sort of testing the waters with these. And from what I understand from watching interviews with the guy, he didn't intend, he wrote them initially without even intending to get them published. They were written for his friends, if I remember correctly, as sort of gifts for friends. But through a series of sort of almost accidents, they happened to land on the desk of a publisher who picked them up. They are highly, highly unusual stories. You can see, again, very much like the Hellbound Heart, you can see the seeds of what will obsess Barker later in these short stories. From what I recall, They are extreme, as the name suggests, and they were marketed on this basis. They are extremely graphic, arguably more so than almost anything Barker's ever written. They are monstrously graphic stories, very lurid, almost beautifully poetic descriptions of violence, of grotesquerie, of sadism, of truly horrendous concepts going on in these. And they range from almost these stories like Rawhead Rex, which is a wonderful horror story of essentially it's almost like it's a monster, it's like a demon or a god of violence that is unleashed from a farm. It's the stone that keeps it sealed is moved, and it erupts from beneath this farmer's field and sets out on this incredible crusade of the most graphic, hideous violence you have ever seen. I mean, there is a film of Rawhead Rex. Do not go and watch it. It sucks arse. But the short story is very, very good. It's not only, it has everything a horror fan could want. It has the monster, it has the gore and all of that, but it also, like all of Barker's work, has a certain degree of profundity to it. It's not just the violence and the gore and the gru. There is something to it. It's almost like a commentary on violence. It has stories like The Midnight Meat Train, which, again, the title is misleading. The title would have you believe that it is just a work of gore, that it's almost like a pornography story. And there's plenty of it. Don't get me wrong. It's a really lurid, graphic story about a serial killer who is operating on the subway system in London, I believe, who is essentially butchering people. But that's not all. That's not the only thing that it possesses. It's almost like a commentary. Another interesting thing about these stories is that these are some of the very few stories where Barker gets political, where he actually does make comment upon politics and wider society, and which he doesn't later on. He explicitly attempts to avoid politics because he regards it as a dead man's arena, as entirely toxic and poisonous and moribund. But there are specifically political and socio-cultural stories in these books, and The Midnight Meat Train is one of them. It's about the nature of society. It's about sort of the roots of history, where history comes from, and how it is all of history, all of civilization, all of society has its roots ultimately in blood and slaughter. That's the commentary, and how that reflects in certain extreme ways in phenomena that we find acceptable in modern day, postmodern, present day culture. It's very clever, very, very clever. You have stories like there's a story, I can't remember what it's called. I don't know whether it's in this volume or the second one. There are 2 volumes of these, by the way, and look, they're huge books. There is no, it's not in this. It's not in this volume. There's a short story where it essentially involves a woman who gets lost while she's on holiday somewhere, Mexico, I think, or Spain, or somewhere like that. And she gets lost on this spit of private land, and gets kidnapped. Essentially, she's taken by these armed guards, these armed people, to this villa. And what she discovers is that this is the secret place. It's almost like a conspiracy theorist's wet dream that Barker's playing with here. This is the place from which all of civilization is actually organized. It's almost like a sanctuary for the best and the brightest and the most intelligent philosophers, scientists, blah, 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 in the world to gather and to organize, to orchestrate history. So they decide who invades who, what economy collapses, which one rises, the shifts in power from one state to another, the wars, all of that shit. It's all decided from here, right? But what she discovers is that for the longest time, these geniuses, these scientists, these philosophers have been playing a game. They've been rolling dice. They've been racing snails. They've been betting on what lizard happens to devour what fly, as to what course history will take, and no one's noticed. The horror of it is that playing the game randomly is no different from it being orchestrated. No one outside or in charge of sort of making sure that these decisions are ratified and that they take place. No one's noticed. It's quite frightening. It's quite an horrendous story in many respects, arguably one of Barker's most horrendous stories. Um, and it's really good. It's really, I mean, it's a very sort of on the nose commentary about the nature of politics and the nature of history and civilization, which is that if it were entirely random, if the people in charge were just rolling dice to see what would happen, whether they would initiate apocalypses or pandemics or economic collapses, it would be little different from what it is now. It's a frightening concept, but it's really good. You've also got one of my favourite and one of Barker's generally most beloved short stories, which is In the Hills, the Cities, which is weird. And again, another sort of commentary on society and culture, very political and also unusually for Barker. No supernatural influences or metaphysical influences at all. Such a weird story. It's about two sort of non-specific Middle Eastern villages that are separated from pretty much all of the rest of society and culture, that have this very odd tradition where every so many generations, the members of each village, the people, lash themselves together in the structures, in the shapes of these giant creatures, these giant figures, and they enact as these figures. It's almost like a play combat, like a play war. It's part of the traditions and histories of these cultures, and it's brilliant. It starts celebratory. It's a wonderful thing. Everybody's very excited to be part of it, but something goes wrong. One of the giants gets into the play of it more too earnestly and ends up killing the other one. So this entire village, this entire town is murdered by the other. And as a result, the giant goes collectively mad. All of the people that constitute it go collectively mad. And the giant starts striding over the landscape, crushing other villages, just rampaging. It's wonderful. The imagery is great. It's the oddest, weirdest, most wonderful thing. And there is actually a comic adaptation of these stories called Touching the Vein, I think, something like that, Touching the Vein. And the imagery from that particular adaptation is wonderful. Tapping the Vein, I think it's called, is fantastic. It's absolutely wonderful. It's such an odd, unlikely concept, and that's what you find throughout these stories. They are not, from what I remember, they are not stories about the horror of horror. They're not about demons being exorcised. They're not about how horrific it would be to be possessed or of having ghosts in your house. They're almost about the attraction of it. They're about the ambiguity of being monstrous, I suppose, and also the allure of it very often, which is something that comes to play much more overtly in Barker's later work. These and also I mean, I'm not finished rereading them yet, but about rereading them now, as a writer. Now, I mean, this might be the first time I've read these books as a published author. Reading them now, there's a degree of pain in it. There's a degree of envy because the concepts of them, not only the concepts but the writing is glorious. They're absolutely glorious stories. They're so well structured and well conceived. I mean, they are for early work, so they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of issues with them, but they are beautiful to read. Absolutely beautiful. They're that horror that not only makes you recoil or makes you scared, they have this sense of profundity about them, which I adore. It's something I seek out in not just horror, but in everything I read. So I will get back to you very soon with my final analyses of the Books of Blood.